2023 had been quite the year for Gaming to Life. After about 4 years since starting this channel, we're finally producing some results. Over 2,000 subscribers in 1 year! It was also the year I uploaded the most videos to my channel. 8 no commentary gameplay videos, 5 documentaries/retrospectives, 8 reviews, and 5 shorts. 26 total videos up to this point. And now we open up 2024 with a video inspired by my life in gaming. A video in which I look back at an hour's worth of games, systems, and accessories that I picked up in 2023. Now here are a fefew production notes. I'll be reviewing games and accessories in separate groups in the following order: Atari 2600, Atari 7800, NES/Famicom, Game Boy, Sega Genesis, Super Nintendo/Super Famicom, Sega Saturn, Sony PlayStation, PlayStation 2, GameCube, Wii, Wii U, PC/Steam Deck, and Nintendo Switch. But I won't be going through everything, just enough to fit into a single hour in the form of my life in gaming style lightning rounds. With all that said, let's begin with the Atari 2600. The best Christmas gift I got this year was the Atari 2600 Plus, a smaller replica of the Atari 2600 that supported original 2600 and 7800 cartridges. It came packaged with a 10-in-1 cartridge containing Adventure, Combat, Dodge'em, Haunted House, Maze Craze, Missile Command, Real Sports Volleyball, Surround, Video Pinball, and Yar's Revenge. The cool thing about this cartridge is that to play the game you want, you have to set the dip switches to a certain position as shown on the label. The same is true with the 4-in-1 cartridge that came with the paddle controller bundle. The cartridge contains Video Olympics, Breakout, Night Driver, and Canyon Bomber. More of the 2600 Plus can be explained in a future video, but for now, this beautiful replica will serve as a source for capturing B-roll footage. In addition to the 2600 Plus, I also got my hands on 2 new games for Atari: Mr. Run and Jump and an enhanced version of Berserk. Mr. Run and Jump had been released for multiple platforms before receiving a release on the very console it was originally intended for, the Atari 2600. I haven't played the newer version, but I do know how tricky this game can get. Plus, these new Atari games, they don't come with manuals. That's my only gripe with them. This game takes a lot of precision compared to games released during the Atari 2600's original lifespan. It's going to take quite a while for me to reach the end. I might not even reach it by 2025. And not just because of how challenging it is, but because of so many other things I had on my plate. Berserk already had a release on the 2600 in 1982, but it lacked 2 features: digitized speech and diagonal shooting. But that all changed with this 2023 re-release. And it's quite a surprise that a player actually gets credited for enemies getting themselves killed by running into the walls. To this day, I still haven't gotten past 5,000 points, but let's see what 2024 gives us. For my Mario Bros. Documentary, I needed a few good condition Mario Bros. Cartridges for B-roll footage. The Atari 2600 version comes first. Now, no one can say this game was perfect, no 2600 arcade port ever is. But the way Mario and Luigi were designed, it was a huge improvement on Coleco's design when they made Donkey Kong and Donkey Kong Jr. I just didn't care much for the way the enemies looked. The shell creepers especially looked a lot more like actual turtles. And the coins that come out of pipes, while beautifully designed, didn't look like coins to me. The bonus game is also a little more difficult to accumulate all 10 coins. And the way the PAL block was designed, forget it. But overall, it was a decent port, considering what Atari was working with.
Pigs in Space!
In 1983, Atari made a game based on the popular segment from The Muppet Show. It has 3 games inside. Chick Invaders is basically a clone of Space Invaders, with no bunkers and with Link Hogthrob as your shooter firing sausages upon egg-dropping chickens. At least, I think they're sausages. A floating Gonzo head hovers overhead in place of a flying saucer. It was definitely the best game among the 3. You'd think Posteroids would be an Asteroids clone, but it's actually a clone of Frogger. In the game, you guide Miss Piggy on the USS Swinetrek while dodging pasta and meatballs. The third is Escape from the Planet of the Gonzoids, where you control Dr. Strangepork as he pilots the Swinetrek in a battle with the pizza-throwing Gonzoids. No reference to any game that came before. Overall, Pigs in Space is a nifty game if only for chicken baiters. Of all the games I picked up for the Atari 2600 this year, it's gonna have to be Mario Brothers. Let's face it, I'm a Mario nut. Nothing's going to change that. As for the 2600 Plus, it's definitely a worthy beyond worthy clone console, if you can call it a clone console. And I heard that Atari is planning on re-releasing 7800 controllers, as well as more 2600 and 7800 games, and hopefully some firmware updates. There's already a beta one out. As to upcoming games, how about giving Yar's Return and Saboteur another shot for the 2600, as well as some 7800 goodies like Asteroids, Desert Falcon, and Ninja Golf. Maybe even give Impossible Mission a fix. Who knows? 4 games for the 7800, 2 loose, 2 in box. Getting Atari games complete in box is usually easier than those for Nintendo home consoles before the GameCube, since most people just kept the cartridges. Asteroids on the 7800 is a huge improvement over the 2600, at least in terms of graphics. The asteroid projectiles and their animations look a lot more like actual asteroids, compared to those in the arcade and on the 2600 and 5200. The title screen looks totally awesome too, but even with an actual 7800 controller, I couldn't get it to work right in the 2600 Plus. Maybe with the firmware update or the upcoming new CX78, it'll improve. Another game that really stood out among my 7800 library was Desert Falcon. Basically Zaxxon on the 7800. Yes, Desert Falcon also got ported to the 2600 and 8-bit home computers, but the 7800 version is definitely the most definitive. But regardless of which platform you play it on, keep in mind, the controls aren't the best in the world, and it's often easier to lose a life flying at mid-range altitude. Compared to the 2600 port, Joust on the 7800 was more solid and close to arcade quality. Yes, the sound quality isn't all that great, but that's just the way the console was designed, and only 2 games included a Poke Chip for improved sound. Joust wasn't one of them, but I wish it was. As with the 2600 version, the 7800 port of Mario Bros. Was picked up for my Mario Bros. Documentary. Graphic-wise, it was definitely an improvement over the 2600 and 5200 ports, and it just looked a lot like the NES port. But again, the sound was grating. Of all the 7800 games I picked up in 2023, yep, it's Mario Bros. Again. There's no question about it. Before I get into any NES and Famicom games, let me just say that owning a Japanese family computer, or Famicom for short, really improved my collection. If I have an NES in my collection, I might as well add its Japanese counterpart. I plan on getting the Japanese counterparts of several others in the near future, and hopefully I'll pick up the AV Famicom as well. My only gripes with the original Famicom is that A, the hardwired controllers are too short, and B, it outputs an RF only. Well, at least only out of the box. Luckily, by autumn, Stone Age Gamer was there to save the day. On that site, I purchased Crix's RGB Blaster, a cartridge accessory for the Famicom that outputs an RGB from the cartridge input. That means the HD Retrovision cable for the Genesis Model 2 should work. And Mr. Add-ons also came through for me with this adapter that plugs into the 15-pin expansion port on the front. I can now use detachable NES controllers, and even the zapper with this thing. I can also use Retrobit's Originate, a wireless NES controller that will also work on modern consoles like the Switch. Thanks to the turbo function, this controller works wonders for shooters. But we'll discuss more about this controller in a later video, coming in the first quarter of 2024. With the addition of the Famicom in my collection, it's a no-brainer that I had to add Famicom cartridges to the mix. Some of those I picked up over the year were loose, and some complete. One of the first Famicom games I picked up was F1 Race, a game that only ever saw a release on the Game Boy outside of Japan. It was developed by HAL Laboratory, the same team that made pinball and golf, and would go on to bring forth the Kirby and Super Smash Bros. Series. It's always neat to play a racing title on Nintendo's 8-bit hardware. It's too bad multiplayer was rare in racing titles on the platform. Again, for my Mario Bros. Episode, I got my hands on the Famicom version of Mario Bros., as well as the NES version. Having learned a lot from playing the game on the Game Boy Advance and the Switch, Mario Bros. Was basically a cakewalk, even though I never legitimately got past 100,000 points. But the fun of this game is in the challenge. Let me ask you guys something. Between the NES/Famicom port of Mario Bros. And the original arcade version, which do you prefer? For me, it's hard to say, since Nintendo's 8-bit console port made very few compromises, and they both play rather smoothly. But please let me know which you prefer in the comments. And that wraps up all the Mario Bros. Ports I picked up in 2023. Now we come to the NES version of Popeye. Compared to its arcade counterpart, you can easily tell that the sprites for Popeye, Olive Oil, and Bluto/Brutus are inevitably downgraded. And, unlike the arcade game, the NES port lacks Wimpy. Sadly, this has gone on to be the best officially licensed port of Popeye. Unless Nintendo can get through some legal hurdles to bring the original arcade game to the Switch, the original NES cart is the way to go if you want to play Popeye at home without MAME. As many collectors know, a loose copy of the NES version of Mega Man 5 is going for well over $100 on eBay, most likely due to its late release in the NES's lifespan. Thankfully, the same can't be said for the Japanese Famicom version, which goes for less than $20. I mean, yes, we can get this on Mega Man Anniversary Collection and Legacy Collection for about the same price, but I prefer to play it on its original 8-bit hardware. Of course, to no one's surprise, this game is still a toughie, compared to the Western version of Mega Man 2. But with a little patience and practice, it can grow on you. Another cool Japanese import I picked up was space shooter Star Force. Now, for me, no space shooter is a cakewalk, but thanks to the Originate's turbo functions, I can easily get further. And when filming B-roll footage for this episode, well, I actually used the invincibility cheat, and I think this might be the way to go if I plan on doing a review of Star Force. For my Super Mario Bros. Retrospective, I needed boxed copies of the original Super Mario games on the Famicom and the NES, or at least just the boxes for the Western versions. The original Super Mario Bros. Black Box was the toughest to get considering its price tag, but it was well worth every penny. I also got a complete copy of the Famicom version of the game a few months prior for a good deal. Yes, it plays no differently than the Western version, but that doesn't make it any less fun. The box art is also really something. I also wound up getting the Famicom Disk System port of the game, as well as the disk system itself, and the Japanese Super Mario Bros. 2. Sure, it's still its usual cruel self in terms of difficulty. It also doesn't help that Nintendo gave the cover art a label saying it's for super players. But if you know the one-up trick, you can actually beat the game without getting a game over, and acquire tons of bonus points. In addition to my box copy of the Western Super Mario Bros. 2, I also picked up Super Mario USA, complete. The only difference between the two is the opening title screen. The Western release had a blue background, while the Japanese version had a black background, which carried over to all releases of Super Mario All-Stars. Needless to say, I had a lot of fun with Super Mario USA, but that's nothing compared to getting complete copies of the Japanese and Western versions of Super Mario Bros. 3. I had a lot of fun comparing the two versions. Aside from the box art and manuals, the Japanese version felt more difficult than its Western counterpart, though not nearly as tough as the Japanese Mario 2. For one, taking a hit with any power-up shrinks Mario down instantly in the Japanese version, while the Western version was more lenient, letting Mario stay as Super Mario when he took a hit with a power-up. I also discovered the bonus item glitch in the Japanese version of World 5-1. I can perfectly understand why Nintendo of America removed that pipe at the end. Now, although that wraps up the Mario games I got for the Famicom, there's still one more game I wanted to bring up, and that's the Famicom version of Tetris by Bulletproof Software, the same team that would develop the Game Boy version of the game. The problem with this version is the controls. You'd have to press down on the D-pad to rotate the tetromino, and A to drop. Cruel. If you want Tetris on the Famicom or NES, the 1989 version by Nintendo is the way to go. Yes, there's also the Tengen version with its 2-player option, but that lacked an essential part, the garbage. So of all the retro stuff I got in 2023, the NES/Famicom definitely had the lion's share, and I'm sure there's more to come for it in the near future. Only 3 new accumulations for Nintendo's popular handheld, the Game Boy. DuckTales was definitely new to the collection. I had already acquired the NES game over a year prior, but when it came time to do a review of DuckTales on my channel, I knew I needed the Game Boy port of the game. Personally, I thought it was a lot of fun, and at first, easily beatable. But thanks to the lower resolution of the Game Boy screen, I found it slightly more difficult than the NES version. But that doesn't mean I didn't beat it, I actually did once. I didn't even care if I got the best ending or not. My cousin was generous enough to donate a bunch of games to my collection. Some were sold to help fund the collection, and others were kept, especially Pokemon Blue version for the Game Boy. These days, it's not easy to find a retro Pokemon game loose for a low price. I thought I'd pick up where my cousin left off. Improve the rest of his Pokemon, capture more, acquire more badges, make the league, etc. Finally, for the Game Boy, I got my hands on the Japanese version of Super Mario Land, with the box, as well as the box and manual to go with my Western copy of the game. Again, this was for my Super Mario Bros. Retrospective, and you can expect boxes from my retrospective discussing Super Mario Bros. Games of the 90s, which might show up as early as the fall of 2025. Super Mario Land, as you already know, really helped to showcase the capabilities of the Game Boy when it first came out in 1989. I know the sequels are a major improvement, but Super Mario Land was definitely the Game Boy game of my boyhood. Now, since I already owned a copy of Super Mario Land before I got the Japanese version, it's not going to count for my favorite 2023 Game Boy pickup. Instead, that honor belongs to Pokemon Blue, a very nostalgic game that pretty much never goes out of style. Thanks, cuz. Why skip the Sega Master System and go straight for the Genesis, you might ask? Well, you see, I don't have a Master System. Yes, I do have the power-based converter I got in 2022, but I only got one game with it, Space Harrier. I never got another Master System game since, but I hope to in the new year. As for the Genesis, I wound up getting 6 games in 2023. Aladdin should come as a surprise to no one. It's a 1993 platformer based on one of my favorite Disney movies of all time. But when I was a kid, I never played the Genesis version because I had a Super Nintendo. So I had to settle for a rental of Capcom's Super Nintendo game, which was completely different. Now, I may already have the game as part of the Disney Classic Games collection on the Switch, but I prefer to play it on the original hardware. And can you imagine how cheap it is these days, even complete in box? The game is pretty tough, believe you me, especially the final boss battle against Jafar. Those flames are hard to get past. But then again, after you do beat him, it's very anticlimactic. I mean, beating Jafar with apples? Plus you don't see him in his genie form. But that didn't stop Aladdin from becoming the third best-selling Genesis game, just behind the first two Sonic games. Besides, Aladdin is really fun to play, despite the challenge. Next is Advanced Buster Hawk Glay Lancer, a Retrobit re-release of the NCS Corporation shooter that was previously only released in Japan. I'm well aware it was ported to modern consoles in 2021, but to have a copy of the game for original hardware without paying hundreds of dollars for the original cart is really mind-blowing. Now this shooter is no pushover. Not once have I gotten past the first level, but it takes a lot of precision to master this game. Ms. Pac-Man was needed for my little documentary of the arcade original. Good thing the Genesis version goes for dirt cheap, even complete. But let's be honest here, when I played it using the Retrobit Big 6 controller, I struggled. The issue with it was that it was meant to be played with a 3-button controller, so I simply switched to an original 3-button controller, and it played beautifully. I consider the Genesis version to be the best home console version of Ms. Pac-Man ever released. It's just too bad I never reached the final stage before I finished this video. Finally, for the Genesis, we have the Valis collection of 3 games. That's right, another Retrobit re-release. Let's start with the original game. This action platformer seems like a breeze until you get to Reiko. I can't seem to evade her strongest spell without perfect timing, but then I found out about a code that replenishes Yuko's health and magic power to full. This does require a second controller, or at least pausing and switching the controller to the second port, and you can do it as many times as you wish. It's just too bad this didn't carry over to the other games. I guess this was just meant to be an introduction to Valis. Next is Sid of Valis, a super deformed version of Valis 2, which was released on the PC Engine CD, or TurboGrafx CD. Sid of Valis was fun in its own way, but I still don't get why we got this instead of the real Valis 2 on the Genesis. Nevertheless, I didn't get too far with this. Finally, we have Valis 3, a major improvement on Sid of Valis, but slightly tougher. I never got past the final boss stage despite deciphering the built-in cheats that still carried over to the Retrobit re-release. Overall, I consider Aladdin my favorite Genesis acquisition of 2023. And why? Well, because it's based on one of my favorite Disney movies. Plus, it's a major improvement over the Super Nintendo version. Now for the Game Genie. So far, I only have the one for the Genesis. The Game Genie for the Genesis is pretty simple to use. Just insert the cartridge on top of the device, then plug it into the Genesis. It also makes for a good adapter to play Mega Drive games from Japan or Europe, although some will still require a code. It'll even let you play games that only work on early Model 1 systems on any Genesis console, except the Genesis 3, which doesn't work with the Game Genie at all. The Game Genie was very helpful in making B-roll footage for my Philios review, since I can never get very far without it, even with the built-in cheats. Another significant accessory I got for the Genesis in 2023 was the Big 6 from Retrobit, which combines both the shape of the original 3-button pad with the buttons of the 6-button pad. Undoubtedly, it worked perfectly with the games that required a 6-button, like Super Street Fighter 2. It also works beautifully on Nintendo Switch Online's Genesis library. Unfortunately, recently, the wireless adapter for the Genesis stopped working. That's the last time I used a Genesis controller on an Atari console. Here's hoping Retrobit releases separate V2 wireless receivers for the Genesis and Saturn in the near future. Up next is the Genesis's main competition, Nintendo's 16-bit Super Famicom, also known as the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. Let's begin with the Super Famicom itself. When I ordered it on eBay, little did I suspect how big it would be. It also came with 2 controllers. Although my Ms. Pac-Man documentary was already done, I still went ahead and bought the Super NES version of the game. I recall owning a copy back in 2001 when my sister got it for me for Christmas that year. Again, I made a huge mistake selling it along with every home console and game pre-GameCube. But it's great having this again. And I haven't lost my touch over the past 2 decades. One big retrospective I look forward to bringing you in 2024 is that of Super Mario All-Stars, and for that I picked up complete in-box copies of the game for both the Super Famicom and the Super NES. Both versions play just the same, but there are a few small differences. One being the box art in the menu, and another being the name. The Japanese version was known as Super Mario Collection. This also applied to Super Mario 3D All-Stars in 2020. Overall, both versions are worth picking up for your library. You can find a complete Japanese version for about as much as you'd pay for the North American cartridge. One of the first Japanese Super Famicom games I picked up was Super R-Type, the Irem space shooter that went on to become an early release for the Super Nintendo in North America. Now again, this is a toughie, just like every other shooter I got. I had to use built-in cheat codes just to get further into the game. But it still wasn't enough, even in easy mode. It's going to take a lot more practice. What Super Famicom collection would it be if I didn't include a Street Fighter game? In addition to Super R-Type, I also picked up a complete copy of Super Street Fighter II, The New Challengers. Aside from the sound, it's hard to distinguish this version of the game from the Genesis port. Besides, Super Street Fighter II happens to be my favorite version of Street Fighter II, thanks in large part to Cammy. Now of course, Super Mario All-Stars is a no-brainer for the Super NES, but aside from that, the honor of runner-up goes to Super Street Fighter II. Personally, I consider it the best fighting game on Nintendo's 16-bit hardware. It had been over a year since I picked up my Japanese Sega Saturn, but I needed more games for it. So I went and bought 5 fighting games. First up, Fighters Megamix. I'd already acquired the Virtua Fighter games and Fighting Vipers the previous year, so it makes sense to pick up a copy of this crossover game, especially for a review. I totes love the balance of play when you pit a Virtua Fighter character against a Fighting Vipers character. I also love going through multiple courses to unlock more characters. And this game is not limited to just Virtua Fighter and Fighting Vipers. Rent-A-Hero, Virtua Cop, Virtua Fighter Kids, Sonic the Fighters, and even Daytona USA get in on the action. I only wish Sonic the Hedgehog himself was included. Another issue I had was struggling to control Hornet. Now concerning my review of the game, I apologize if the story leading up to this release took up almost half the video. I just thought I'd throw in a little history to give viewers a good idea on why the game came to be. Pocket Fighter, aka Super Gem Fighter Minimix, was my first Saturn pickup of the year. I had gotten the Capcom Fighting Collection the previous Christmas and spent that night playing the original Pocket Fighter arcade game. You know, the one with all the chibi art style versions of Street Fighter and Darkstalkers characters. Unlike most Capcom fighting games, Pocket Fighter has a neat feature, leveling up moves with gems. The game is also said to be Capcom's way of introducing their fighting games to a more casual demographic. I hope to do a full review of this game in the new year. I only wish Cammy had been part of the roster, although we do see a cameo of her in the game. Do you think Pocket Fighter deserves a sequel? Street Fighter Collection really does give you the most action for your buck on the Saturn. It includes 3 Street Fighter games, including an updated version of Street Fighter Alpha 2 or Street Fighter Zero 2, with a Goki/Akuma mode out of the box, and an unlockable Cammy in the Versus mode. Now, in my review of the game back in May, I pointed out the sides shaved off, but I later discovered that the capture was actually the result of my RetroTINK 5X being in the wrong mode. I had that in generic 4x3 mode when it should have been in Saturn mode. When I captured footage in that mode, I found no cropping whatsoever. I sincerely apologize for that little mistake. Capcom Fighting Collection also inspired me to pick up a Darkstalkers game for the Sega Saturn, Vampire Hunter: Darkstalkers Revenge. It's basically a fantasy-themed version of Street Fighter, and being the Street Fighter nut I am, I was able to adjust to the controls of this game. I mostly played as Morrigan or Felicia, considering they tie for my favorite characters in the series. but when and if I ever get the chance to do a full review, I'll give the other characters a shot. And I also plan on picking up the sequel, Vampire Savior, for the Saturn. Lastly comes X-Men vs. Street Fighter.
This is X-Men vs. Street Fighter!
Probably one of the best Sega Saturn imports known to man. Why? Well, there had been plans to release this game in the West for the Saturn along with the 4MB extended RAM cartridge, which I don't have at the moment. But Sega of America, having suffered too much from the Saturn's premature launch in 1995, pulled the plug on the platform, thus killing any chance of Sega releasing the RAM cartridge stateside. Capcom decided that rather than release the 4MB extended RAM card themselves with X-Men vs. Street Fighter, they'd bring the PlayStation port to the West. As for the game itself, it's an astounding crossover between Street Fighter and X-Men, with tag team battles. My first playthrough, I played as Cammy and Wolverine, but of course not every battle in arcade mode is tag team. After beating Apocalypse, the two players you picked are pitted against each other. You control the one who landed the final blow against Apocalypse. And that wraps up all the games I got for the Saturn this year. But we're not quite done with this lightning round, because I wanted to show you the Sega Saturn Pro controller by Retrovid. Why buy this when you have one already, you might ask? Because of the analog sticks, of course. When I use it on the Saturn, it works fine as a normal Saturn controller with the D-pad. Fighting games were a breeze, of course, but when it came time to test out the analog sticks, well, I only attempted it on one 3D game since I don't have Nights into Dreams at the moment. I tested the stick on Daytona USA, and it worked okay, but then again, this is the original edition of Daytona USA, not the Championship Circuit edition. And personally, I preferred playing it with the D-pad. I'll do a full review on this controller in a later video. We only have one game I acquire for the original PlayStation, and that's the Japanese version of Dead or Alive. I also managed to hack a memory card with free PSX boot. Now I can play PlayStation backups, as well as games from any region. Now to Dead or Alive. Although series creator Tomonobu Itagaki considers the Sega Saturn port to be the best version of the game, the PS1 version does have its own perks. For one, it has two more characters. Tina's father Bass Armstrong, and Kasumi's half-sister Ayane. However, I still haven't unlocked Ayane yet. Still, give Dead or Alive a try on the PlayStation. It's inexpensive, but the Japanese version is the cheapest available. Now on to the MemCard Pro from 8-Bit Mods. What's it do? Well, it acts as a memory card, but utilizes micro SD cards. A single gigabyte can carry up to 8,000 original memory cards. I have a 16 gigabyte card, so that means 128,000 memory cards. No more need to buy multiple memory cards. 8-Bit Mods also came out with the MemCard Pro for the GameCube, and there's one for the PlayStation 2 coming real soon. I hope to get my hands on those. Finally, for the PlayStation, we have the Defender by Retro Fighters, a controller that acts as a wireless PS1 controller. Needless to say, it works beautifully. If you haven't jumped on one yet, please do. And it'll also work with the PlayStation 2 and 3. And speaking of the PS2, in addition to Pokemon, my cousin also donated a collection of PlayStation 2 games, as well as his PlayStation 2 Slim. Now, at the moment, it needs some TLC, because when it plays, it makes a weird buzzing noise. Of all the PS2 games I got from my cousin, I'll only be looking at one of them, Street Fighter Anniversary Collection. It's a 2-game-in-1 collection containing Hyper Street Fighter 2, the Anniversary Edition, and Street Fighter 3 Third Strike. It also includes a censored version of Street Fighter 2, the animated movie. Why would Capcom censor it, you might ask? Well, they were trying to keep the collection at a T rating. The movie seemed too violent to include as it was, without rating the collection M. And Street Fighter was always meant to be rated T. But thankfully, Discotech Media's Blu-ray release of the movie is there for you. Overall, another neat compilation. Back in May, I did a review of Retrobit's Legacy GC controller for the GameCube, and it's definitely the best budget-friendly substitute for the expensive Hori digital pad. I had no issues playing Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance games on the Game Boy player, nor with certain GameCube games. One of those games I tested out with the controller in that review was the Japanese version of Super Smash Bros. Melee, known as Smash Bros. DX in Japan. Released as the first sequel to the popular N64 game, Super Smash Bros. Melee was a first of many for Smash creator Masahiro Sakurai, including using actual polygons, orchestral music, and putting the game on disc. I also have the North American Player's Choice version of the game, but it needs resurfacing. The Japanese version of the game, which is cheaper than the Western version, helps bridge that gap. And since my GameCube has Swiss, playing imports is easy. I really love the multiplayer, the bonus game, and the unlockable trophies. It was definitely a major improvement over the N64 original. Now for the two games I got from my cousin with the PS2 games. First up, Mario Kart Double Dash. Growing up, I used to play the game when I visited my cousins, or they visited me. Playing as two characters on a single kart really makes the game stand out among the others in the series. Think maybe Nintendo could implement co-op in the next Mario Kart game? Finally, for the GameCube, we have Super Mario Sunshine, the long overdue follow-up of some sort to Super Mario 64.
Super Mario Sunshine! Woohoo!
The concept of Mario trying to clear his name by washing toxic slime from Isle Delfino and recovering shine sprites makes for a very compelling storyline. But this game won't be covered until my retrospective of Mario games released in the 2000s. And I haven't even started on the 90s retrospective, which is planned for 2025. However, I had difficulty getting past a few stages. Then again, it's one of the most difficult 3D Mario games of all time. Aside from lost levels, you can't get any tougher than this in the Mario series, right? I seriously doubt that. I got extremely lucky at a garage sale during the autumn, finding 3 Wii games at a low price. The first is Wii Sports, the best-selling game released on a single platform. The sports I played most often on this were bowling and boxing.
Nice throw.
I hear that the latter is what most likely led to the development of the Wii version of Punch-Out! I played the hell out of these games so much that I wound up aching in my right arm. The same thing happened when I played Super Monkey Ball Step and Roll. I tried as hard as I could, but let's face it, Joe from GameSack is the king of Super Monkey Ball. I may improve eventually, but I doubt I'll ever be as good as him. Plus, I can't use any GameCube controllers. The game requires the Wii Remote, hence the aching arm. At least it doesn't last long. Lastly, we have Mario Party 8. Aside from motion controls, new boards, and party games, it's still your typical Mario Party game. There was one board in particular that can be really cutthroat. One minute you're investing tons of coins into a hotel to get as many stars as you can, and the next minute, someone out-invests you, taking the stars away. I only got one new Wii U game in 2023, but before we get to that, let me remind you that I got the game just days before the Wii U and 3DS eShops shut down. There were sales galore. I downloaded as much as I could before the shutdown. One of the games I purchased was DuckTales Remastered, basically a completely remastered version of Capcom's DuckTales on the NES. It has awesome animation, a few extra stages, and voiceover work. Most of the original voice cast, who were still around at the time of the game's development, reprised their roles as their respective DuckTales characters, especially Alan Young as Scrooge McDuck.
Magic and Glumgold still have my #1 dime, and I'm not leaving without it. You boys get going.
Good luck, Uncle Scrooge!
There was one issue I had with this remaster game. The final stage after beating the final boss takes a lot of trial and error. I had to resort to playing the game with unlimited lives just to get B-roll footage, but after about dozens of tries, I finally managed to pull it off. But let's save the rest of my opinions for an upcoming review.
Get us out of here, Launchpad.
With the retro games out of the way, it's time to move on to the more modern platforms. Probably my biggest purchase of the year would have to be the Valve Steam Deck, a handheld gaming computer that I'd spent over a year saving up for. It includes a Linux desktop mode and Steam OS, though one day I would like to add Windows to it, but I'm okay with it as it is. It makes for a wonderful emulation station, as well as my go-to system for PC games. Sonic the Hedgehog 4 Episodes 1 and 2 may not be on everyone's list of Sega goodies, but these short yet sweet 2.5D Sonic games almost feel nostalgic. Each of them features gameplay similar to the games on the Sega Genesis. They also feature world maps, allowing you to go back to a stage to try and beat your own high score in time, and maybe even pick up an unclaimed Chaos Emerald. Now these games were tough to get working on the Steam Deck at first, since they weren't compatible out of the box, but with a few little tweaks, they were as good as new. Kandagawa Jet Girls comes from Marvelous, the publisher of the Senran Kagura series. It's basically Wave Race with a more fan service twist. I only got a few hours of play into the game, and I may need to practice some more, but overall it's a fun game, and there's even a DLC available that allows you to play as Senran Kagura characters. I also love the Kandagawa Jet Girls anime. Now if only we could get another Senran Kagura game, even if Marvelous has no involvement. How about Sega, Capcom, Idea Factory, Koei Tecmo, and/or Acquire? Let's hope for the best. Now for the reason I purchased Steam Deck in the first place, Street Fighter VI! Characters from the previous games were given new makeovers, especially Ryu, Ken, Cammy, and Chun-Li. Some were also given new and more powerful moves, but I mostly got the game for the sake of it being a modern fighting game. For the past 3 years, Street Fighter V was my go-to fighting game on Steam, but after the release of Street Fighter VI, that all changed. But don't expect me to show up in esports tournaments, I just play this game to play. The game received a Game Award for Best Fighting Game, which is great, but I wish it had also been nominated for Game of the Year instead of that other game. I really should get around to downloading new fighters in 2024. I hear Akuma is coming. Now we get to the big one, the Nintendo Switch. For most of the year, it had been digital only when it came to new purchases, but the titles I ended up downloading were all pretty solid. F-Zero 99 was definitely the best free-to-play MMO I played all year on the Switch, but it really gets frustrating to try and get to the top spot no matter what I do. How do these other players do it? Now let's get to the Arcade Archives downloads. The last game I picked up in 2023 was Burning Force, a direct port of the Namco System 2 arcade shooter. I plan on doing an actual review of this game in the coming year, but I need a copy of the Genesis port. Now the game itself, it really gives off some Space Harrier vibes. Then again, the new Straits Times review of the game in 1990, they felt the same way, but not in a good way. Plus is the third game in the Galaxian franchise. It's really neat how in a Galaxian game, one can actually fire multiple projectiles at once, using captured enemies. The bonus stages, however, one would need at least 4 times the usual firepower to do it perfectly. Still, it's definitely worth $8 for a download. I recommend giving it a whirl. Dragon Spirit is yet another Namco shooter, but unlike space shooters, you're controlling a dragon. Well, a human taking the form of a dragon trying to save a kidnapped princess from a demon. I haven't gotten very far in the game yet, but hey, there's tons of games to go through. What do you expect? Phelios. The original arcade version of Namco's mythological shooter was definitely in need of a release on modern platforms, and to have it on a Nintendo platform like the Switch really makes up for it not being on the Super NES over 30 years ago. Now, let me be frank here. The only reason I was able to get B-roll footage of myself beating the game for the review was because of the save system each Arcade Archives game has. Xevious, or is it Xevious? Where would I be without this classic Namco shooter? It's too bad I haven't gotten beyond the first boss. I need a little more practice if I plan to do a review of the game. Anyway, did you know the background music was used in the game show Starcade for the Hotline segments? Here we go again with Namco. This time it's not shooters, it's the pole position games. They were long overdue to get ported to the Switch. The only gameplay differences between the two is that Pole Position 2 has 3 extra racetracks. Another thing to note is that both games utilize the Japanese ROM of the game. You can tell by the blimp holding up the prepare to qualify sign in Japanese characters. You can also hear the Japanese voice samples. Why? That's a mystery. And that's it for Namco on Arcade Archives. I only wish they'd localize Marveland, even under a different name to avoid any legal issues with Disney. But we're not done yet with Arcade Archives. There's 3 more games to go. One of which is a 2D fighting game from Tecmo that predates Dead or Alive. Toki Densho Angel Eyes, an underrated arcade fighting game that previously never saw a release outside of Japan. Even the PlayStation port was Japan exclusive, and today it goes for a pretty penny on eBay. Thankfully, Arcade Archives was there to save the day, porting the arcade original to the Switch and PlayStation 4 in 2022, but I didn't download it until a year later. I plan on using this B-roll footage as research material for my Dead or Alive retrospective. As to the game itself, one time I'd struggled against Reika, and especially the final boss, Angel. I used multiple characters, but it took me nearly 2 hours to finally beat the game. If I were playing the actual game in the arcades, I'd have sunk over 100 quarters. Now the characters... Highway Star. Isn't that the Japanese Rad Racer on the NES? Next is Route 16, a Sun Electronics driving maze game, recommended to me by a relative. It almost reminds me of Rally X, except in this game it's much easier to crash into something, especially when you're in high speed mode. I rarely, if ever, exceeded 10,000 points. Finally, we have an Arcade Archives port of a Nintendo Versus System arcade game, Versus Balloon Fight. Basically a clone of Joust, with a few twists. I plan on doing a little retrospective of this game as well as the NES version. I just need to get a physical copy of the NES version. The script is more than halfway finished. What really creeps me out in this game, regardless of which version I play, is that fish. It gives off about half as much of a jump scare as the Maw-Ray eels from the 3D Super Mario games. Nonetheless, Versus Balloon Fight is a decent arcade game, despite its vertical scrolling, which makes the game a bit more difficult than the Famicom/NES port. Now, if only Nintendo would allow Hamster to port their pre-Donkey Kong arcade games to the Switch. Now to the physical Switch games, all of which I got on Christmas of 2023. Let's start with Kirby's Return to Dreamland Deluxe, a remake of the 2011 Wii game, which I never played, might I add. It was the last game developed by Vanpool before the company went out of business. Now, even though I never owned or played the original Wii game, my experience playing Kirby's Dream Land and Kirby's Adventure really got me far in the game before the year ended. True, I could have completed it before, but I had so many other games on my plate with only a week left in the year. Nonetheless, Nintendo and HAL are on a roll releasing Kirby games one year after another. Who knows what they'll bring us in 2024, assuming there is a Kirby game planned for 2024. WarioWare Move It is one game among the new Switch games I didn't get far in before the year was over. I needed a little more time to practice this one. So let's move on.
Roast. Way to go.
Sonic Superstars may not be the best 2D Sonic game on the market, but it was a big improvement over the Sonic the Hedgehog 4 games. Again, gameplay practically resembles the Genesis games, and it almost seems too good to be true that the bonus stages to get the Chaos Emeralds would be a breeze. But it's going to take some more practice to get this down pat so I can get all 7 and see the true ending. Sonic Origins, released a year earlier, has a litany of Sonic goodness. For the first time in years, we finally have a port of Sonic 3 and Knuckles on modern platforms, even with new music. But the expanded release, Sonic Origins Plus, released in 2023, added more features, especially all 12 Sonic games released for Sega's handheld Game Gear. With the 3DS and Wii U eShops shut down, this is a good way to play expensive games like Tails Adventure on a budget. My only big issue with this compilation is that the Master System versions of some Game Gear games weren't included. When Nintendo announced a remake of Super Mario RPG for the Switch, I was surprised. I never expected Nintendo to remake their collaboration with Square. This remake came with an easy mode for beginners. And that's the mode I used when I recorded this footage, because I never actually played the original game on the Super Nintendo. I mean, yes, I have the SNES Classic Edition, but I focused mostly on Super Mario World, Street Fighter II, and Donkey Kong Country. Now, the remake not only included an easy mode, but it also allows you to damage enemies adjacent to your target, if you have good timing on hitting the target. There's also triple moves that deal massive damage, but to access these moves requires not only a party of 3, but filling a gauge with successful action commands. Of all the games I picked up that Christmas, this was the only one I was able to beat by the end of the year. Of course, I haven't gotten to the post-story battles, least of all Culex. But considering I beat the final boss nonetheless, I think it sort of counts. There's no doubt in my mind that Super Mario RPG on the Switch is the best non-Pokemon RPG I ever played. Not only on the Switch, but period. I'm starting to regret ever skipping it on the Super Nintendo. Maybe someday I'll pick up an original copy for myself. And let's hope Nintendo and Square Enix can collaborate on an actual sequel. We saved the best for last with Super Mario Bros. Wonder, so far the fastest selling Super Mario game. It also got nominated for Game of the Year at the Game Awards, alongside The Legend of Zelda: Tears of the Kingdom. But unfortunately, both lost to that other game. Anyway, Super Mario Bros. Wonder features a litany of new power-ups, including Mario transforming into an elephant that sprays water. Plus, when you're about to lose a life while playing online, you can tag another player or one of their standees to get back in the game. These translucent online players can also help give clues as to where to find giant 10-flower coins and the Wonder Seeds. Of course, even offline, this game really blows my mind. The best 2D Mario experience I've ever had on the Switch. But you know what I think Nintendo should do next for a 2D Mario game? One that almost feels like Sonic Mania, a 32-bit style game with actual 2D sprites. Well, that wraps up all my gaming acquisitions of 2023. Basically, 2023 was the year of the Mario Brothers. The original Mario Brothers arcade game turned 40 years old. Super Mario Bros. 3 and the Western Super Mario Bros. 2 turned 35. Super Mario All-Stars and the original Super Mario Bros. Movie turned 30. Mario Party turned 25. Super Mario 3D World turned 10. The new Super Mario Bros. Movie released to immense fanfare. And now we have Super Mario Bros. Wonder and the remake of Super Mario RPG to wrap it all up. It only made sense that I pick up so many Mario games old and new for my collection. The only sad part of all this is that Charles Martinet, who had been the voice of Mario and Luigi for over 30 years, has retired from the role after voicing the Mario Brothers' dad in the Super Mario Bros. Movie.
These are my boys!
He also voiced Giuseppe.
Too much? It's perfect! Wahoo! Okay, I'm gonna trust you.
On the plus side though, he's now the Mario ambassador. Today, Kevin Afghani takes on the voices of the Mario Brothers, as well as Wario. Before we wrap up this video, let's look at the list of 10 retro gaming goodies I aim to accumulate in 2024. Burning Force for Sega Genesis. Castle of Illusion starring Mickey Mouse for Sega Genesis. Sega Dreamcast. Dead or Alive 2 for Dreamcast. Balloon Fight for NES and Famicom. Super Mario World for Super Famicom. Super Mario Kart for Super Famicom and Super Nintendo. Vampire Savior for Sega Saturn. A regular PlayStation 2. Xbox 360. Yes, I know the Xbox 360 isn't retro enough, but since Microsoft is shutting down the Xbox 360 store in the summer, it might be a good time to pick one up and download what I can before it's too late. As for Switch and PC games, well, we'll see what 2024 gives us. As for future projects, I got a script for my retrospective of Super Mario All-Stars all set. And once I get Balloon Fight on the NES and Famicom, I'll get started on my retrospective of that game too. I may also do the same for Dr. Mario. I also plan on putting out a documentary on the Game Boy to commemorate its 35th anniversary, and the same goes for the Sega Genesis. Also, if you're new to this channel, please subscribe. And if you'd like to contribute, click the thanks button below. You can also click on the affiliate links in the description. When it comes to Amazon, remember, once you click on an affiliate link, if you buy anything at all, even toilet paper or solder, you're supporting my channel. Thanks again for watching Gaming Delight. Until next time, Happy New Year and happy gaming!